Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday, May the 21st session in our series on entrepreneurship in Asian high-tech industries. I'd like to start out by thanking the member companies of the US-Asia Technology Management Center because it's their support that allows us to put these programs on. And we have some networking refreshments for everyone who's here in person afterward. Want to thank our member companies for that support as well. When you look at anything that's Asia-wide, you have kind of two choices. You can either look at a location and something that's happening in the location, or you can look at some domain and how that plays out in different Asian locations. So today we're looking at the whole concept of climate tech and sustainability from the investor side, not so much from the startup side, but from the investor and investing opportunity side. And we have three panelists who will take us from Japan to Southeast Asia and Greater China to South Asia. And I'm very happy that two of our panelists are with us in person, and one of our panelists is with us online from Singapore. And so I'll go the introductions in alphabetical order. Mark Inkster, who's with us from Singapore, is the co-founder of Asia Sustainability Angels. And it's always a pleasure to welcome a Stanford alum back. Mark got his master's in what is now management science and engineering. After graduating from Stanford, he worked at HP. He did some work with Bain. Then he led the launch of Yahoo's services at sites around the world. He joined eBay EachNet in China in 2003 and as its chief product officer and has basically lived in Asia ever since. So he has founded a Web 2.0 startup in Shanghai. He has also run Microsoft's online business in Southeast Asia. He led Vistaprint's expansion into global energy markets, and in the process kind of started shifting into an angel investor role. He's been a venture partner with the Antler VC firm in Singapore, and then he founded or co-founded Asia Sustainability Angels, which is a Singapore-based angel community. And this is Mark's second time to speak with us. The first time he not only spoke, but he brought a couple of his portfolio companies, which were very interesting. We did a whole series about Asia business driven by climate tech and sustainability. I guess it's about 3 years ago now. So it's great to see Mark back with us. Thanks for joining. Sitting closest to me on stage is Shin Ogawa. And Shin has been with us for a couple of years now as a visiting scholar at the US-Asia Technology Management Center. He came 2 years ago on a Fulbright Fellowship. And the Fulbright Fellowship recognizes professionals in various fields, gives them the opportunity to do research in the United States and promote deeper mutual understanding. So Shin came from a journalism background. He was with RKB Mainichi Broadcasting in Japan. He had his own show. One of his series of news stories about disaster recovery received Japan News Network's Top Story Award, Top Prize Award in 2018. He also now is kind of going back and doing a little bit of podcasting and freelance writing. You can find his work in Forbes Japan in recent months. Since the Fulbright Fellowship ended, he stayed with us for a second year. And in the process of this second year, he's been doing research into climate tech and carbon credit markets. And recently, in the context of his research, he's started to advise MOL Switch, which is the corporate venture capital, strategic venture capital group of one of Japan's biggest shipping lines, Mitsui OSK. So, Shin, we're delighted you're with us. And sitting closest to the podium is Joe Pattabiraman. And Joe is a partner with Aureolis Ventures. And you may remember that our speaker on April the 23rd, Ms. Paula Mariwala, was kind of the head of Aureolis Ventures, the managing partner of the firm. And Joe is focusing on impact investing inside Aureolis. She started out operating companies and internet businesses. She worked on the early payment company CyberCash. She took various leadership roles here in Silicon Valley with Oracle and eBay and Yahoo, also smaller venture-funded companies. She moved back to India in 2008 to her home of Bangalore and helped businesses, including things like OnMobile and Nolarity, which is a Sequoia-funded startup. She has appeared widely in the press, in the Wall Street Journal, in CNBC, and she is the founder and CEO of a company named GrowFit, and she's been a partner with Aureolis since 2022. So I'm delighted that we can get three different perspectives of what's going on across Asia in regard to climate tech and sustainability investing. Let's go in order from Japan, Southeast Asia, China, India. So Japan's first. Shin, you're up.
Thank you for the great introduction, Dr. Rusher. Hello, everyone. I'm Shin Ogawa, a business scholar at US-Asia Technology Management Center. And I came here 2 years ago as a Fulbright business scholar. And I conduct my research on the climate tech trends and carbon credit markets. And as Dr. Dasher mentioned, I also have a position as an advisor at MOL Switch, which is a Japanese CVC company investing in the climate tech fund, climate tech startups. And I also have 7 years of experience as so let me start with my story. I was born and raised in Japan. I started my career as a TV reporter, and there was a heavy rainfall in Japan, and 40 people died in 2017 because of the landslide. And I reported at the front line of the affected areas from the very first day. And I ended up with living in the affected areas to keep covering the story for 1 year. And what I realized is it takes much longer to recover from disaster than we imagine. And that is how I got interested in the climate tech and climate change. After that, I started to cover the climate tech stories in economic development, including EV bus startups and Toto's innovation to save water scarcity in Japan in 1970, and solar shelling farm. And through this experience, I believe the best solution for climate change is making new businesses. And that is how I came to Stanford. And this is my current research topic at Stanford. My first year, I engaged in traditional study within climate techs. And I also research on the specific challenges faced by climate tech focused funds. In addition to that, this year, I began to research on developing the new methodologies for carbon credits. And I have several collaborating projects with private sectors. Okay, let me introduce MOL Switch. MOL Switch is a climate tech focused CVC funded last September, and that is based in Palo Alto. And MOL, Mitsui OSK Line, is one of the biggest maritime shipping companies in Japan, and which set the goal of achieving net zero emission by 2050. And there are three investment focus. The one is the hydrogen/ammonia, which could be the alternatives for bunker fuel. And the second one is a carbon dioxide removal technologies, because the maritime industry is designated as a hard to abate industry. So MOL needs to buy some carbon credit to achieve carbon neutral. And the last one is a battery and nuclear power plant, nuclear power, which could be a disruptive technology for maritime industry. Like if batteries ultimately evolve, electrification of large vessels becomes possible. But at this moment, the world's first electric container ship equipped with 1,000 lithium-ion batteries only go 50 miles, so it remains to be seen. And this is a portfolio of MOS, which we do invest in both startups and LPs, and Heirloom is a dark startup using limestone to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And Starfire Energy is a green ammonia producer. And the Core Power is developing floating nuclear power plants. And AP Venture is famous as a hydrogen-focused VC. And MCJ Collective is the VC of the podcast, My Climate Journey. Okay, let's get into the Japan market in the climate tech. On top left, there is a financial overview last year. 118 climate tech startups raised 635 million in total. And 234 million, it means like 36% of all was invested in the electricity grid, followed by transportation and food industries. And there are some investment in the climate fintech and carbon removal technologies, but the portion is still limited. On the right side, recent 2 or 3 years, there are some climate tech focused funds coming up, and Henry is famous as a deep tech VC in Japan, and they raised 64 million fund 2 years ago. And Marunouchi Innovation Partners, they are the Mitsubishi Group backed VC, and they have 400 million funds to invest in middle to later stage. And the last one, UMI, is material chemical focused VC, and they have 90 million fund to invest in early to middle stage startups. And there are some university backed funds and bank affiliated funds, and both of them are very active to invest in climate tech in Japan. Okay, let me introduce some of the promising climate tech startups in Japan. The JE Plan is turning abandoned clothes into renewable fuels, and the fuel is already used for airplanes. And they did a very good demo with the DeLorean, which is from Back to the Future. And the car is turning waste into the fuels to drive. And the media really loved this story, and that is how they get popular. And Kyoto Fusioneering is developing advanced technologies for commercial nuclear fusion reactors. And Elephant Tech is a manufacturer of printed electronics, which reduces materials by 70% and waste by 90%. So the big techs like Apple have high interests in their technology to produce carbon neutral products. And this is a climate tech map in Japan made by Jyotsna. And a lot of startups are located in the energy and power sectors, but there are some in material and chemical industries. And this is opportunities that I see in Japan. There is a large potential for spin out, because major companies recently started entrepreneurship and open innovation program. Like industrial companies such as Toyota, Sony, and Canon lead R&D in Japan. And they have great IPs and technologies within the company. And another aspect is that enterprise companies have a strong influence and connections within the supply chain. So spin-outs from large companies benefit from the backing of these corporations, making it easier to test products and develop customers. And there are some use cases. The one is EV Motors Japan, which is an unsuccessful EV bus startup. And their core technology of battery management system was developed in Nippon Steel, which is one of the largest iron companies in the world, and where the founder used to work. And another use case is from Toyota. Entrepreneurship at Toyota has launched a maintenance system startups for offshore wind power plant, utilizing Toyota's IP. Another opportunity is that Japan needs founders from all over the world. Because non-Japanese founders have good perspectives to the global market, And they are also open to communicate with international investors since they have no language barriers. That could be the big advantages in Japan. And there are a few incentives for Japanese to start a company because of the unique permanent employment system prevents Japanese people to change their jobs, and it causes the lack of entrepreneurs. And lastly, the immigrants make innovations in Silicon Valley. And there are some great immigrant founders in Japan as well. And Japan recently started the visa support program for entrepreneurs, including the climate tech sectors. So I will introduce one use case, the EF Polymer, which is a startup producing organic absorbent polymer made by bio-waste. And the founder is from India, and he is supported by Japanese boards. And he started the company while joining the university's acceleration program in Japan. So where do you find investment opportunities in Japan? I recommend two places. The one is university. Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, we call it OIST, O-I-S-T. It's based in Okinawa Island, where the far south from Tokyo. And more than 50% of faculties and students are international. And there are some interesting spin-out in agri and bio industry. The EF polymer I mentioned at the last slide is one of them. And the other one is the University of Tokyo, which is one of the best universities in Japan. And there is a program named Fund X that provides a free support for recent graduate researchers who are starting or have just started the startups. And their focus area includes climate tech. And another one is a startup program. J Startup is a joint program between the government and private sectors. And they select the promising startups every year from all over Japan. And 20% of the selected startups are the climate tech. And they have a good English website, so you can easily look around. And the NEDO is one of the external agencies of Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. And they offer a comprehensive support program for climate tech from seed to later stage. And NEDO also facilitates collaborations with businesses and provides support for talent development in deep tech startups. Thank you.
Okay, Sheen, thank you very much. One thing you didn't mention much was the carbon credit market. Do you think Japan will move forward pretty quick in that, or do you see other places moving forward faster?
In my understanding, Japan is coming very late at this moment.
Let me ask you to stop sharing.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
So because of the tax of the carbon in Japan, it's very low. So there is no incentives to buy a carbon credit in Japan. That is the biggest reason that the carbon credit in Japan is not much popular.
Okay. But I also want to clarify that last slide you showed was that if you have a startup and you're not Japanese, you might really consider moving to Japan to start and grow your company.
Yeah,
that's your point. Right?
Yeah.
Why? No, I mean I'm actually with you in this, right? You know I'm a believer in this, but from your perspective, what do you think is good about doing this in Japan?
The fund is very rich. Like a lot of people wants to invest in the startups, especially in the climate tech, but we don't have enough entrepreneurs. So like I would say the market is very rich with a few competitors. That is the Japan market I recognize.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's hard to believe, but there's a lot of money, and the market in Japan is also quite favorable. People are quite environmentally conscious there. So that's an advantage. For our next prepared comments, I'd like to flip over and ask Mark if you would give us some comments now. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. So I was lucky enough to grow up north of where you are right now in Oregon in the 60s and 70s when the environmental movement was recognizing that all the natural beauty around us was under threat from development. And a lot happened in those days. Oregon protected its coastlines from development, made it publicly accessible, created the nation's first bottle bill, created the nation's first legislation against chlorofluorocarbons. So that was the world that surrounded me growing up. I went off to college, studied engineering at Stanford, studied engineering management, as Professor Dasher said. And thank you, Richard, for the introduction. I won't go through the details of it as you did. But basically, my career did not do much around environmentalism, even though I remained interested in it over the years. The big theme over the last 30 years that I've been working has been what Mark Andreessen called software eats the world. And my career has reflected that. So I spent the first half in Silicon Valley working for companies that were taking technology and disrupting industries. So computer manufacturing, media, e-commerce were all being disrupted at that time. Moved to Asia and continued that. So really, I ended up, kind of to my surprise, disrupting 7 different industries. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I said, hey, it is now time to focus more on my long-term interest in the climate, in the environment. So we now call it sustainability, but it's really the same message that we were thinking back, over the last 50, 60 years. A lot of people have been marching in the same direction. I helped co-found a electric vehicle startup here called Beam. Unlike the West, here in Asia, at least Southeast Asia, most of the innovation is happening in electric two-wheelers. So Beam is electric scooters and electric bikes and a little bit of electric motorcycles. And after doing that and doing some early stage work at Antler, about 3 years ago, I started Asia Sustainability Angels. And we started by recognizing the problem that most of the capital being deployed is focused on growth of traditional industries that tend to be extractive, tend to pollute, and really want to grow rapidly. And if you take that growth and say the rest of this century, if you have a relatively modest growth rate of 3%, the economy grows 10x. If you pull that out another century to 2200, the economy grows 200x. So if you think that we're pushing the world's environmental limits now, if we just grow as usual and deploy capital as usual, then we're going to end up with a even dramatically more unsustainable world at some point in the future as we grow. So that was the problem as I saw it. And as I reflected, I came up with 5 core beliefs, which together constitute my theory of change and constitute the foundation for what we're doing at Asia Sustainability Angels. These are all clear probably to most of the people in the audience, but we need to stay within the planet's boundaries. To do that, we need new approaches. One of those new approaches is new technologies and new business models, and that's what innovation is all about. I've worked in startups, I've worked in corporates. I found that startups are a fantastic vehicle for bringing new ideas into the world. So really believe that using the power of entrepreneurship to drive innovation in areas where the world needs more innovation is the right path to go. And I see that Shin has come to the same conclusion. I expect a lot of people in the audience have also come to the same conclusion. I also looked around me, found a lot of smart entrepreneurs who are trying to solve these problems. And as awareness and interest in climate tech continues to grow, I see more and more founders going into the space. They need capital, and there's still a very large lack of capital focused on these problems. A lot of various consulting firms, Bain, BCG, McKinsey, put the number at 3 to 5 trillion levels of investment needed annually to go after to meet our goals. So that's massive. And if enough of us focus on this, we can all play a part in making that happen. So that's the core way I think about it. And we've operationalized that with Asia Sustainability Angels. So we look for businesses that are investable, that are strong, good quality startups, that also help the environment. And there are plenty of great businesses out there that don't help the environment, plenty of great organizations that help the environment that aren't good businesses, but we look at that intersection. It has to be a great business, and it has to be something that as it grows, it naturally creates a world where the environment is better than if the alternative had grown. So that electric vehicles, electric replacement of fossil fuels with electric fuels are the kinds of things that we want to see happen. We started with 3 people 3 years ago. We've grown to over 50 people, and it's mostly investors in Southeast Asia who are passionate in this area and want a community of like-minded people. We all have some experience working with entrepreneurs and helping them create strong businesses. The background of our group is about 1/3 from tech, 1/3 from finance, and 1/3 from a variety of other places. We have some venture capitalists, some 2 professors, we have a couple of consultants, some family offices, person from the government in the group. So it's a nice mix. And we try to have people with different backgrounds. We have some from food tech, some from agriculture tech, some from mobility, and across the board, when we find a new company, you usually have an expert within our group who can help all of us learn about that industry a bit more quickly. We're operating at the very early stage of investments. So we invest in pre-seed through Series A. Our check sizes as a group are about 50 to 200K. We've done 16 deals so far, and we're about to do 2 or 3 more. So we'll pretty quickly get up to 20. So we're on the 5 to 7 a year investments in this area. We focus mostly in Southeast Asia. The 6 categories are reasonably common. People slice and dice this differently, but these are pretty consistent across climate investors around the world. So mobility, mostly electric mobility, food and agriculture, and actually those 2 things each are very big. There's a lot of work going on alternative proteins and all kinds of food tech, and also a lot going on with agri-tech. Energy transition, the carbon economy. There are a lot of different carbon exchanges and people focused on different elements of the carbon economy in this part of the world. The built environment is a pretty big source of carbon emissions in this part of the world, both the construction of buildings because of all the concrete used, and then also the heating and cooling in the tropical climates. So that's a big topic. And then finally, industry and circularity. So some of the things that Shin was talking about are very much on our radar screen as well. We operate across Southeast Asia, which is mostly the 6 ASEAN markets. We are investing broadly in companies that solve problems that we face here or take advantage of the strengths that we have here. So an example would be here's in mobility, Sleek and Eddy. Those are both electric mobility companies that are 2-wheelers. They're e-motorcycle companies, and there are massive numbers of gas-powered internal combustion engine motorcycles across Southeast Asia. In the next 10 years, many of those are going to become electric motorcycles. So there's a massive opportunity that people are following here that really doesn't get much attention in the US or Western Europe. In food tech and agriculture tech, I'll give an example. Husk. There's a lot of rice farming in this part of the world. When the rice gets farmed, it used to be dehusked near the field. Now it's transported to a big processing center where the rice is removed from the husk, and the husk is mostly waste, and it's low value waste that doesn't necessarily make sense to be driven somewhere in a truck. So it often just gets left out in the field to rot, and it turns into methane, decomposes into methane. what this company does is it takes those rice husks, turns it into biochar, combines that biochar with fertilizer, and then the farm, it sells it to farmers below the cost of fertilizer. The farmers put in the soil, and the carbon gets sequestered for hundreds of years in the soil. So it's a nice kind of a mix, but it's the kind of thing you would only see in this part of the world. That in the US, again, North America, Western Europe, you don't see people innovating that area. So there's some interesting approaches here that solve our problems. But not all of these problems, not all the companies are necessarily Southeast Asian companies. So that company is based in Cambodia, but it's actually led by a British entrepreneur and a Spanish entrepreneur, and it's a parent company in Spain. So we do look around the world for companies solving Southeast Asian problems. And those problems are coming from the characteristics here. So the tropical ecosystems that we have mean that there's not only different kinds of agriculture, but also there are a number of ways of other characteristics you can have. The carbon sequestration in the tropical forest here is one. Biodiversity is growing, so people are focused on that as well. So there's a lot of opportunities based on just our tropical ecosystem. We also have the rapid urbanization, so that's driving the built environment. The governments across the region, like in Japan, are supporting climate tech. So in Singapore, for example, there's a lot of work going on in food security. There's a lot of work going on in material science that can be applied across a lot of climate tech use cases. We've got a lot of tailwinds as well. So rapidly growing GDP, a large young population, and the entrepreneurial environment here is very different from Silicon Valley. It's much newer. In the past, there have been generations of entrepreneurs doing sort of big industries, but in the last, really the kind of tech entrepreneurship that we're used to seeing in the VC world really only has grown in the last 10 to 15 years as the internet penetration in this part of the world has grown. But that's increasingly strengthening, and we're attracting founders from around the world, especially European founders moving to Southeast Asia. Richard asked me to talk about some of the trends. The first one is that the interest in this area is growing very rapidly. So I started Asia Sustainability Angels 3 years ago. There were a few people in Southeast Asia focused on this, but really not very many. And I've seen since then, just in the last several years, we've had at least 3 venture funds have started in this area, and a lot of the generalist investors have started to invest in climate tech. So things like electric motorcycle companies, battery companies are getting investment from traditional VCs here as well. A lot of the 3 years ago, 4 to 5 years ago, very few entrepreneurs were building climate tech companies, but we're seeing more people who are experienced entrepreneurs saying, hey, now I want to focus in this area, and increasing levels of government support. Singapore is a low-lying country. If sea levels rise, it will create major problems here. So the government is increasingly putting a lot of effort into climate tech. So that's grown a lot. That's sort of trend number one. Trend number two is that people have discovered that they shouldn't just follow what's going on elsewhere in the world. The consumer internet businesses basically were copying ideas from other parts of the world, bringing them to Southeast Asia. That's a bit less true here because the needs and the characteristics of the economies here are different. We talked a little about e-motorcycles, but the whole world of agriculture and the food world here is different. People eat different things. People grow things in different ways. So, we've come across a company recently that's doing cultivated chicken broth. So instead of trying to make the cultivated chicken meat, which many of you may have seen is now available in Singapore, they're making chicken broth as a way to try to increase adoption. People may not want to eat cultivated chicken nuggets, but they may have a lower barrier to entry for other form factors of the food. So far, though, it is a pretty early environment. It is mostly pre-seed through Series A, with a very beginning level of interest in biodiversity. So I'll stop there, but that's an overview of what's going on in Southeast Asia.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. If you would
Close the screen.
here in your slides for a minute, let us see you. I'm going to follow up with a question that came in from chat from the audience. From Pascal. Pascal asked if you would invest in fashion industry like circular economy, secondhand clothing recycling or whatever. How do you see that?
We have not found the way to do that yet. There are a lot of there is a lot of clothing manufactured in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and we'd like to find a way to invest in that. We've looked at some materials companies, some sort of more recyclable materials. We've looked at some industrial efficiency companies to reduce the waste that's used. Have not really found anybody doing upcycling or that sort of recycling that you mentioned. Some of that, we've seen a little bit of, but there's not a lot of focus on that yet here. But that certainly is an area of interest.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll continue with the Q&A after we've given Jo a chance to give her prepared remarks.
Well, thank you, Richard, for organizing this event, and thanks to Shin and Mark and to the audience for their time and attention. My story is that I also am a graduate of this great institution. I went to the ASB, graduated in 2002. Some fun fact, this used to be the old GSB building. So flashback to past times when I was sitting editing PPTs at the last minute, brought back a flood of memories. And so I was an entrepreneur. First started off as an engineer, worked on some early online payment systems, then did my MBA, I was at eBay and then at Yahoo. When, as Mark said, they were growing rapidly. Then I realized that I really wanted to get back to startup companies. I played operational roles, venture funded companies, moved back to India, started something in health. Paula was an investor. And when I sold the company is when she invited me to join her. So that's a little bit of my story. I would also say that I'm relatively new to climate investing. And I think that is actually positive, simply because there's still a lot to be done. And sometimes an outsider perspective can be useful. But for today's presentation, I thought I would zoom in and out. I'd start with talking about what exactly is happening in India and tell you where there's promise. And I'll zoom into the investing, the funding stack, and then talk about venture capital and sub-risks and opportunities. And of course, we don't have time to delve into each of these things in detail. So I'm actually going to fly by, just really hitting the top notes, but feel free to follow up with me if you need more data on any of these things. So a little bit about Aureolis, the company that Paula, also a Stanford alum, founded. We think of ourselves as patient capital. We invest like a VC. We are a VC. We invest, however, in areas that give impact and enable human progress. That's mostly health, deep tech, and climate increasingly. We mostly invest in India, a little bit in the US and other areas, simply because of government regulations. But we like to speak to entrepreneurs and investors from all over the world. It so happens that 40% of Aureolis companies are women-led, something that we didn't start out to do, but we're very proud of. And I think, we expect great things. Well, I'll just talk a little bit about the climate crisis in India. So the climate crisis, so the way that India looks at climate is very different. On a per capita basis, even India does relatively well. It only produces 7% of global emissions. And on a per capita basis, Indians are not driving, Hummers and taking private jets to different places. So from that perspective, there's a little bit of a double take when, we are asked to cut down on emissions and so forth. So, but from a growth perspective, one of the most strategic companies, because unlike Western Europe and the US, where carbon emissions are declining, GDP is increasing. And so India is a lot is being expected from Indian companies and India as an economy. From an Indian citizen's perspective, I think Indians do face disproportionate climate impact. As you can all see, if you read the news, there are heat waves, there's floods and storms, soil quality is depleting. And for a group of people who didn't really do much to cause it, I mean, they are facing the brunt in a pretty significant way. Similarly, from an economic perspective, there's impact on food security. There could be an economic impact, and the population impact because of the workforce, which may not have the ability to protect itself from these vagaries of climate change. I think Sadiq Khan, who is the mayor of London, talked about this at the Vatican Summit on Climate Change recently, saying that the people are most vulnerable to climate change are the ones who did the least contribute to it. So with that in mind, the way that we look at it is there something that we can do in India that is good for the world? Where is the opportunity in this whole thing? Can we innovate? So I think one of the areas is low-cost technologies, whether it's Earth observation satellites, or if it's agriculture or manufacturing. A very interesting thing is that India has not industrialized. So there is a chance to do it right the first time. And similarly, on the other side, it's a very low-waste economy because frugality, repurposing, reuse is built into the genes in some sense, right? So people are just less likely to, in the sense they're more interested in figuring out how to repurpose, how to reuse, and so forth. And there are many ways, it comes, it is seen in the kinds of companies that people are starting. The picture that you're seeing is from a plant of a company called Loham, which is founded by a Stanford grad. And what they do is to repurpose battery materials for reuse, and maybe even getting it back to be able to reuse it in a battery form itself. So this is a well-funded company in India. So that's the kind of focus. There's some of the opportunities that you can do in India for the world. And is it really doable? It's a great storyline. But one of the things to point to is the success of renewable energy in India. One of the things is that India is the decarbonization is carbon emissions are decoupled from GDP growth. Since 1990, India's economy has grown by 7x, but carbon emissions have grown only by 3x. And that's very important because it holds the key to something that Mark was saying earlier. If you keep on growing at the same rate and emitting at the same rate, we're going to be in deep trouble. But I think what we're trying to do in India is decouple those two things. You can have good GDP growth and not necessarily carbon emission growth. And it's had some success. So India is the third largest producer of renewable energy. And as we'll see in the following slides, we'll look at what happened to enable this change. Since 2015, India has been hitting all its mark in terms of moving away from fossil fuels, which is the gray notch here. And eventually, in about 2030, sorry, we're going the renewable energy is going to make up about 50% of India's energy mix. So that is already happening. It is not academic. And when we look at one of the things that enabled it to happen, since we're talking about finance, a lot of people came into India wanting to invest in that space. And this is one of those things which is known as the nth of its kind. So solar is a proven bet. There's a high demand. And in fact, there's just not enough solar, as there is demand. So people are rushing into it and as investing. And you can see that how the financing stack changed. Basically, you have a lot of stuff which is coming in the form of BS financing is balance sheet financing, which really means that you are investing based on the company's assets and so forth. And there's project debt and there's equity, and very little is grant or philanthropic money. And the kind of players who come into India to invest also, quite varied. You can start with sovereign funds and pension funds and financial institutions. Many of these are, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment, close to billions of dollars worth of investments, right? So nonetheless, even though it's billions of dollars of investment, India really needs 3x as much. So if you've got some money burning a hole in your pocket, this is one of the areas where you can put it. And one of the things that I wanted to share from a well-known financial expert called Nat Bullard is really how the cost of Indian debt is one of the highest in the world. Only South Africa has highest debt. And that's because of all the risks that are being piled on. And honestly, what happens when when this number crosses 11% and goes to 12% is more of the cash flows go into repaying debt than actually putting up the asset, right? So here you begin to see, here you begin to see some of the unique challenges with capital and climate financing in particular. Are there potential opportunities to reduce these numbers? Are there different ways that people could take a look at it? If that's possible, then that would make a very big difference to the way how quickly and easily India was able to finance transition to renewable energy. So if you look back at this and see what is this climate stack, funding stack for climate, you can think of it in two categories. There's non-dilutive, which is debt, grants, and so forth. And on the other side, there's dilutive, which is equity. And that equity comes from incubators, angel syndicates, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about what each of these folks do. When we really look at, and I'm going to focus a little bit on venture capital because that's what we do. When we look at, and unfortunately, this is a overall, and not just venture capital, but overall investment. If you look at where is investment going in India, you can see a lot of overseas investments are going to mobility, but in India, it's mostly energy. And there's also a difference when I went to, SF Capital, SF Climate Week, a lot of the companies and investors were talking about extracting carbon from the air. In India, it's different. It's preventing it from getting there in the first place, preventing it from emitting carbon in the first place. So that's a very different take on carbon emissions. If you look at climate tech venture funding, you find that since 2002 and 2000, since compared to 2003, most of the segments have actually crashed significantly, whether it's edtech or consumer tech or SaaS, but climate has held relatively steady. And as of now, VCs, about 310 institutional investors invest in climate tech, and roughly about 10% of their investable equities investable funds goes, and a little bit more than that, 15% goes into climate, which is slightly higher than the global average, which hovers around 10%. Similarly, most of the investments tend to be in the seed stage. And the reason being that late stage deals are very expensive. There are only a few companies which attract late stage funding. And 3 of those companies happen to be, very large mobility companies, which each raised more than $100 million. But there's a lot of money, there's a lot of activity and investment happening in the seed stage, which is also very promising because many technologies are being being invented, which you can call as first of a kind. They use the acronym FOAK, first of a kind, and NOAK, nth of a kind. So, if you folks want to look it up. But most of the deals range between 1 to 5 million. The reason, and we'll talk a little bit about why there's this gap in later stage funding. So some of the companies that we invested, thought we would share that. One company is called Fasal. It's an agri-tech company. It addresses the way that climate change is impacting farmers, whereas farming in India used to be mostly father to son passed down from generations. Because of climate change, you might have unseasonal rain, you might have too much heat, you may have pest infestations and so forth. So Fasal uses satellite data as well as this particular device you can see, which they also have sensors in the soil, which tells farmers exactly what they need to do. They'll be like, right now, go out and you can use this much of fertilizer on your soil. Or did you know that there is a infestation in this quarter of your soil? So this is a company that we invested in. And one of the things you'll also notice is, venture capital is not enough. And we saw from solar is not enough just to have equity investment. You need to have a wide range of debt, so that a wide range of investment vehicles, so that you can match the risk with the reward, right? For example, if one of the things that Fasal does is buy the output of its farmers because it also has a lot of information. It knows what is growing, when it's going to come to market, what's the quality of that crop. That information is very strategic. And it uses that information to make those sales, which means that sometimes they may need invoice discounting. They may take on collateral-backed debt and so forth, just too expensive to use equity in the years. We have another investment company called Nopo, it makes carbon nanotubes, single-wall carbon nanotubes, There's another very interesting company because the way that they make these nanotubes is by putting carbon monoxide under tremendous pressure. They're making their own reactors and so forth. So even though NOPO has raised over 3 million in equity, the chances are pretty high that they're going to need different types of financing to actually fulfill on their promise. And they've been lucky enough to get grants and awards. And they also do pilots with battery companies and so forth. This is a circularity company we have called Alltech, similar to what Mark was referring to. They use agri-waste to make chemicals. Industrial chemicals is a $500 billion market. A lot of it comes from sources which have a very poor impact on climate, which could be forestry, which could be petrochemicals and so forth. These two young men, both graduates of, one is a graduate of MIT, one is a graduate of Berkeley, are looking at that to figure out how you can get more green chemicals into the system. And part of the success is not just the chemicals, but the way that they are doing it in a modular or biorefinery fashion. Well, when we look at what are some of the challenges, where is a walk and the talk not matching in climate investing, you'll find that there is a complete mismatch between where investments are going and what impacts climate. For example, a lot of money is going into mobility, but as it happens, not nearly enough is going into manufacturing and so forth. And that's a real problem. And I think that begins to get to the heart of one of the thorny issues, which is that why should VCs invest in things which are cutting carbon emissions? No, there is no incentive for them to do so. They do it if the market rewards it, but they are not. Venture capital investments are not tied to climate outcomes. So that is one of the issues that we need to address. The second issue is that when you look at venture capital models in the past, and Mark has talked about it, it's really take a small team and then you can still address a massive market, right? And it all happens in virtual reality, in cyberspace. Well, climate is happening in real time, and it's happening to all of us. And the risk movement from place to place, it changes very significantly. So, for example, if you think about NOPO, which made carbon nanotubes in nanograms, for them to go into micrograms and grams, and eventually, so more than that is a big step change at every area. And at every point, there is a new set of risks. Whereas in a SaaS, you could just be like, let's hire 10 more salespeople. But in the climate, because it's deals with real things, that's not enough. At every stage, that there is a new discovery. And I think that's another reason where we see the VC model kind of begins to not quite fit to what we need from climate. But I mean, the good news is that the capital is available if we connect the dots. There's literally $33 billion of dry powder that VCs have allocated that they're waiting to invest. And I think if we're able to bridge that gap, I think that would be fantastic news for all of us. So. Well, this is honestly the summary that I wanted you to maybe consider. The first thing is economic growth can be climate friendly if you invest early enough and in interesting enough technologies. You can have things that actually both create economic growth and are climate friendly. The second thing is, you need to have a diverse capital stack for climate, and equity by itself is not going to be rewarding enough or sufficient, honestly. And so, each one of these different sources of capital need to play their part. And I think the final thing is, for me, at least, a multifaceted climate investing lens needs to be developed. And that's why, I'm hoping that one of you has a thought on it. Maybe it's going to be Shin's carbon markets. It could be something else. And I think innovation is needed in financing and funding as well as in technology. And I want to say thank you to many of my colleagues from the great class of MBA class of 2002, as well as 2006, and other VCs who helped me with perspective on this. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, Joe, thank you very much. So I kind of have a question for you. You mentioned that a company probably will need to take out different kinds of debt as well as venture capital in order to grow sufficiently.
Yeah.
How does the venture capitalist fit into that process? Are you a very hands-on investor?
Well, I think where VCs can, and I'm speaking specifically about India,
Yeah.
but where VCs can help is to stand, in some sense, guarantee that this is a legitimate company and we have gone through due diligence and so forth. So for example, if you've seen, and that slide which showed that the kind of the corporate risk was one of the highest, like was 3% in India. It's the same as risk-free rate. So what VCs end up doing is saying that yes, it's a legitimate company and so forth. We don't necessarily need to give the debt ourselves, but what we can do is to make introductions and show that this is a legitimate company where funding.
Right.
To be given. I don't know that answer.
Okay, no, I think that's a good answer. Why don't you join us on the panel? And I've got a question for everybody, and then we'll get into question and answer with you and also with people who've been writing their questions in on chat. So kind of the question, and it really goes back to the Venn diagram that Mark showed in your slides about, things that are kind of very profitable and things that lead to greater sustainability, and you want to invest in the overlap. A lot of people assume that if you're an impact investor or you're focused on sustainability, that you may give less returns to your LPs or whoever is backing your fund. And so my first question for you is really, how do you convince potential LPs that sustainability investing is good investing for a profit? Who wants to take that first? Mark, that was your slide. You want to take that first?
Sure. And I'll bring up another concept visual of a 2x2. I think of things with one axis being the financial returns and one axis being the impact returns. And what we're aiming for is the top right quadrant, right? We want a high impact return and a high financial return. What that means is we don't invest in a lot of really good causes that unfortunately don't have the financial model, and other kinds of capital need to invest in those, and maybe that's more philanthropic. It also means that there are some opportunities we miss. So there may be some massive high growth consumer internet startup that's going to make people a lot of money through online gaming or through e-commerce, whatever else it is. And we do miss on those. So that's a conscious choice. But having said that, I think there are massive returns that are possible. Well, two things. So one is I do think there are massive returns possible in this space. And second, as Joe was saying, I'm not convinced that financial returns is the only thing that people should be looking at. And when I look at the people who are part of our angel network, yes, they want financial return, but they're not primarily doing this for financial return. They would like to make money with this investment, and they know that they're going to lose money on some, so they have to make it up with others. But they also want to support entrepreneurs and collaborate to help our common problems. So the motivation, that's part of the motivation. I'll say one last thing, which is that so far we've had very low failure rate of our companies compared to other angel groups. So I personally believe that climate founders are deeply motivated by the problem that they're solving. Like they're putting their energy into this, not just to make a buck, but because they deeply want to help. And that motivation leads to a level of tenacity and scrappiness that I think gives the climate tech startups more chance to hold on. Then the flip side is exactly what Joe said. If you're banging atoms around and eventually to make climate happen, you've got to make some change in the physical world. It's hard to make that grow asymptotically. So it's harder to get that really exponential growth out of it. But you can still get very solid growth.
So I'm going to follow up that question specifically with something for Joe. And that is, do you find that in this space, climate tech, sustainability, whatever, do the entrepreneurs need sort of special help that they might not need in other industries? Or is it pretty similar to other industries?
I think, speaking to the entrepreneurs angle, I think they are actually better than what I've seen in other industries. So they're like, and I've seen them like, people who, they really are getting their hands dirty, they're discovering, they're experimenting. I think what has really been, in some sense, unfair to them is that they are judged by the same yardstick as e-commerce and SaaS companies. And I think that's where, any help that we can give them in terms of working through, who would be a better source of this cash, let's not try to raise equity for this, let's try to raise debt for this, or, in some cases, is there like an asset-backed loan that they can take? Is there like, can we advise them to do discounting of invoices? And I think that's much more on the side of, help that VCs can give entrepreneurs here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Sheen, my kind of follow-up to the same question for you is, okay, this gigantic shipping line, Mitsui OSK, has decided that for the focus of their strategic venture capital, not just for financial return, but for things they can learn that will help their kind of company strategy, they've decided to focus on climate tech. Can you say anything about, was this somebody in the company who was a real champion of the idea, or how did it happen? Why would they be interested in climate?
In Japan, in 2020, the Prime Minister Suga declared Japan will achieve the carbon neutral country by 2050. Then, just after that, a lot of enterprise companies followed the government's initiatives, and they declared, "Oh, we will do that," as like the government did. Then, once they set the target, like carbon neutral by 2050, Japanese companies are very, very serious. So even sometimes it doesn't make sense from the finance perspective, but they decided to do that. Like, so I would say from entrepreneurs' perspective, it is Japanese investors tend to value social values or like social impact more than the investors in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. Open the floor to the audience. Ken, why don't you go first? I saw your hand.
I want to talk to all three. Clean tech has been a long-term thing in the ag area and area. Getting the second round is much harder than getting the first round, especially with government grants coming in the first round. Companies are not ready for sophisticated investments in the second round. What are you doing with your companies to get them ready for that?
I can speak that if you like.
Joe, you go first and then Mark for sure. Sheen, I'm not sure you have anything on this because of the nature of CVC, right? But we'll leave it open to comment. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, the first thing is to choose the company wisely, right? We saw in India many agri companies before we invested in Fasal. And the reason that we invested in this company was, first of all, they were getting farmers to pay for technology. They had a kind of a unique insight and information that could be extremely valuable, that they were turning into invoices that were being, that were turning into cash. And so there was literally, the founders had to be to the VCs who were ready to invest, right? So I think that it's a rare company which has, triple bottom line like Fasal. But I think what we say to the companies is, are customers benefiting from your product? Who are the customers for your product? And are they giving you, enough money that you can eventually become a profitable company? So in that sense, we are as, direct with them as with, so cash flows need to come from customers. We need to still apply the VC lens. It's just that they're happening to do it in climate, if that answers your question.
Thanks, Mark. Do you have other comments on this?
Yeah, one is just building on Joe's point of the importance of selecting companies and Joe's earlier point about debt. We look at a lot of companies that are financially viable, could have strong returns, but are just not going to attract those next stages of capital and don't have an obvious exit path. I think the lack of the exit path draws the lack of late stage capital. And I think those are great candidates for debt, especially if they have a decent cash flow. We're looking at an Indonesian e-waste recycling business right now. It's got really nice cash flow. Unclear how it's really going to scale, but it's a nice candidate for debt, as an example. Then the second main point is I think we prepare our companies just like any other early stage investor would help prepare the company. It's mostly just about building the business. So it's helping them figure out how to get traction, how to get commercial traction, how to focus on the right problems, how to make sure that they really are building differential competitive advantage, all that kind of stuff that you would see in VC business. That's what we're trying to help these companies do. It's just that when they grow, they will also have a climate impact.
Okay, thank you. Shin, so added to this in the CVC world is the interest in a company like Mitsui in getting some sort of strategic relationship or knowledge about the business that the company is doing. Why do you do anything with companies to help them be ready for that side of the relationship? I mean, you're kind of a new fund, but
Yeah.
you've got 3 investments already, right?
Yeah, so I would say the MOL is very active to invest in the climate tech startups. The half of that purpose is understanding new technologies that might be disrupting their existing businesses or like other like new competitors are coming up.
Yeah.
So the half of the budget they designated half of the budget is to learn the new things and checking around new coming market.
So they are doing things like setting up pilot projects for the companies they're investing in and that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
the CVC is very unique position. They can help with fundraising for startups and they can be a customer of the startups. So we have a lot of approaches.
And I've got one more follow-up for you that comes from online. Catherine has asked, what unique characteristics are required to start a company in Japan? For example, if you're not Japanese and you don't speak fluent Japanese, how do you approach it?
There are some like startup communities around Tokyo and they are very supportive to foreigners. One is the Shibuya startups and the other one is the CIC Tokyo, I think. And the supporters are very fluent in English, so you can reach them out.
Yeah, okay.
And the government also very supportive.
Yeah, let me add that there are a few incubators or accelerators in Japan that are specifically focused on helping foreign startups locate in Japan. For instance, if they have a pilot project with a big Japanese company. One of the ones that we've had a speaker in our programs in the past is Shibuya Startup Support, which is one of our former students from here is the CEO, Ms. Watabe. So yeah, there are resources that will help you get over those kind of obstacles. Other questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Yeah, from the entrepreneur's perspective, I want to know the difference between, for example, running a company in Asia versus running a company here in the United States. What do you think the similarities and what do you think the differences?
For anybody, go ahead.
I can start here again because I'm right here, but one of the things, at least speaking from an Indian perspective, is the cost of capital. The cost of capital in India is huge. The second thing is from a different, there are lots of, local challenges which may deal with regulatory perspectives or what have you. You have to build everything. I think the United States has the luxury of standardization. Other economies are still building those standards. So it's easier to scale in the US than elsewhere. Many times you're challenging those, you're solving those challenges the very first time. And so on the other hand, the plus side is that you get to be part of an emerging economy, at least in India. And so it's possible that if you're coming with the right mindset, you could create like a once in a generation company. There's also, that's another way to take a look at it. I do feel like a lot more core innovation is happening outside the US. So if you're somebody with like a, world-changing idea, you could think where you want to start your company, in Europe or Asia or anywhere else.
Okay. Mark, comments?
Yes. Southeast Asia is very different from America in a couple of ways. One is that it's the ASEAN countries are six very different economies from each other. Singapore versus Vietnam versus Philippines versus Thailand versus Malaysia are just completely different markets. So we have 600 or 700 million people, but they're spread out in a lot of different places. So that means that you have to pick a market generally first and go after that market, grow there, and then expand if you want to go across Southeast Asia. There are also some companies here that have a global market in mind. They're going after global market. They're just taking advantage of some of the strengths here. But then you have the challenges of operating remotely. So those are probably two very structural challenges that are among the biggest ones we face. We also have a much less mature innovation ecosystem and financing ecosystem. So it's harder to start a company, harder to grow a company. It's all getting better, but those are headwinds that the industry still faces in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, here in the US is more competitive than Japan. If you want to do the climate tech startup, then Japan might be the good place because the investors can understand the social value. So they don't have to have a like financial return as soon as possible or something.
They are focused on social impact.
Yeah, they are very understandable about it.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anup Pradhan, founder CEO of Vajra Power. This is a US-India company. And my question actually touches on a lot of the conversation today. So we all agree that climate is a global problem. There's no doubt about that. So what about capital flow? Instead of moving entrepreneurs from one country to where the capital is, what about moving capital from where it is to the country where the entrepreneur is and potentially scaling out from there? So at least within the boundaries of Asia, where markets also and climate is also kind of similar for localization. So if any of you and all of you can touch on that, that would be great. Thank you. And thanks for all your insights so far.
So I do think there's a lot of capital moving around. If I can comment a little bit on this, did you notice how many of kind of Silicon Valley VCs were co-investing with Aureolis? And so you do see this. I think what's the challenge from the investor side is due diligence. And you want to be able to have enough knowledge of how the team operates in order to really get a sense for whether they are likely to be successful or not. It's not only what you find in the written records about the company. That's a great question, though. Yeah, go ahead.
So I moved all the way from here. I know you didn't pick me. I just moved here. Just make sure you see me. So, because Mark is not in person. So my first question is, do you mind sharing your email address? So I'm a climate tech entrepreneur.
Sorry, we don't give out email addresses. However, if you send me an email,
Okay.
I will give out my address.
Yeah.
And if you send me an email, I will relay it to the speakers, and then at their discretion, they can reply.
Okay, so that makes sense. So because I'm a climate tech entrepreneur, so definitely Mark is my kind of target like investor right now. So, but so the thing is like that my company definitely will be the next unicorn, but so just a matter of time. So and also for Jyotsna. Is that how to pronounce her name?
It's called me Jo. Yeah, I mean, when people struggle with.
Yeah. So, and also if you, because I can send you the pitch deck as well. So, also the reason why I said like my company is definitely the next unicorn. Firstly, I know some unearned secret. Next thing is.
Carry this conversation on after the program's over. I think you're pitching your company.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so we'll get into that after the full program's over. Other questions? But thanks. Oh, back in the back. I'm sorry. You're right. I don't see over there well. In the far back behind you, the person behind you first, and then you. Okay.
So how have you seen navigating some external investment processes? Like if someone starts a company in Japan or India or in some of these places. How would you suggest navigating the government restrictions on outside investing? For instance, I know the Ministry of Finance has placed energy as a strategically important area for Japan, and they put hurdles in front of investing into Japanese energy companies. How do you navigate that in Japan, again, in India, other Southeast Asian countries? And how do you advise startups that are handling that kind of particular, I guess, problem?
Great question.
I mean, I wish I could give you a great answer, but it depends on a case by case basis, and lawyers have to eat as well. So it's a kind of a pretty well set up process. It's quite transparent and so forth. There are very few corner cases. It's just that in some, so I think if you want to invest in India, there are vehicles to do it. Similarly, I would imagine with Japan and so forth. You may not be able to invest in everything, like you may not be able to invest in nuclear energy or like, drone companies or whatever, but like there might be other sectors where you can invest.
Yeah, we are also struggling with that problem. So if we want to invest in the like battery company in the US, and there is a strict rules from the government. So our budget is coming from Japan, originally from Japan. We are located in the States, but originally my budget is coming from Japan. So we like, for example, we can't have any like observer seat or something like that. Regulation is always coming to us. So it's case by case, but.
Mark, any comment?
I'd add one thing, which is it's not just about the investing, it's also about the ability for the companies to expand between countries. So the agriculture industry has very specific rules in different countries. So if you're trying to sell fertilizer with biochar in it, and you're selling it in Cambodia, but you want to sell it in the Philippines or in Vietnam, you do actually have to go through some rigorous government processes at the company level as well as the investor level.
Thank you. Good. Go ahead.
So my question is more for Joe. Somewhere I think the gentleman in the front talked about capital moving from the States to India. I just wanted to know if you are doing something to get the Silicon Valley mindset, not the capital, but the mindset from here to India, because it's a risky, like starting up is risky, and tech is risky. So, and coming from the similar background, you might know that failing and experimentation are pretty new to that part of the world. Is there anything you can?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the things have changed a lot in India. For example, now you actually have Shark Tank in India where people just pitch various things. So failure is considered kind of acceptable, not like people, it's not desirable. And I think Paula has spoken about how the mindset has changed. So I definitely see the Silicon Valley mindset there. I think probably I would say it's kind of, there are two parts of it. One of them is like the entrepreneurs drive to create and all of that's happening in a big way, right? And I think the second part is honestly just the capital. There's really, for all the things that are happening in India, there's only a fraction of the capital that is required. And some of it is about regulations, about due diligence and all of other things, corporate risk that Richard touched on. But I'm hoping that will change. But society is moving very fast in just a couple of years. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're about out of time. I want to ask a quick question around the table to our three panelists. It has to do with the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs by the UN. So it does not appear that we're on track. And I wonder if you have one or two things that you would each like to say would really help the whole system move faster with innovation as a solution to at least the climate-related SDGs. You go first.
Oh yeah, so we are not in track, and everyone knows about it. And what we are doing as MLL is just starting with investment or just be a customer first, even that they're developing their technology itself. And I think the most important thing is the government's regulation subsidies to the climate tech startups, and that is also halfway the investors invest in the climate tech startups.
And that also kind of addresses your question back there. Yeah. So Mark?
One of the biggest criticisms, I think, of doing early stage investing right now is that our impact will probably be 10 plus years from now. And we have so much that we need to do in the next 6 years to keep global warming in the near term down, that really the whole world of doing late stage investing in well-known technologies is much more urgent in my mind than what we're doing. So I think we're laying the foundation for what comes next, but that also has to happen. So I think the biggest thing we need is more talent, more money going into commercializing and growing the things that already exist. We also need to do the things that we're doing, but that's from a 2030 perspective. I would then add on the sort of hopeful and positive side, two things. One is that the European regulation that is going to essentially tax carbon in people's supply chain is really driving behavior in this part of the world. So we see companies, manufacturing companies in Southeast Asia that want to sell to Europe. They are actively trying to figure out how to decarbonize, how to deplasticize, how to change their behavior. So it really can matter. That's number one. And then number two, the EV adoption in China is just astounding. So if you look at the speed with which some of the markets here are adopting new technology that will have benefits for the climate once there's enough solar and renewable generation capacity, it is also pretty positive looking forward.
That's great. Thank you. Joe, the final word.
I think incentives have to be aligned. I think if you stop subsidizing fossil fuels and so forth, that provides a path to a more sustainable world. And the other thing is, we can't consume our way to climate change. Like, people have to give things up, and I think that it requires coming together of different institutions for us to catch up on our climate.
Okay, so this is a big part of the solution, but not the whole solution. Right. Okay, so everyone, please join me in thanking our panel.